David is described by Samuel, who's talking to Saul, as a man after God's own heart. And we've often picked that up as sort of the clearest description of the piety and the faith and the commitment of David to the Lord. We have to look carefully at what that phrase means and what Samuel's referring to. I mean, 1 Samuel chapter 13, and Samuel has told Saul he's acted foolishly. He says, "You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." What does it mean to be a man after the Lord's own heart? We've usually thought that it describes David in his pursuit of God, of the heart of God, and so that he's a man pursuing after God's own heart. But when we look through the rest of the Old Testament and the way that phrase is used, we find that that's not the case at all. Rather, the phrase typically refers to someone making a choice of their own. In this case, God, following his heart, is making a choice according to his own criteria. If we looked over just a page in 1 Samuel 14, in verse 7, twice it talks about doing something according to your own heart, and it talks about make your own choice. Do what you decide to do. We find parallels also in a place like Jeremiah 3:15. In these passages, God choosing a man after his own heart is equivalent to God choosing by his own criteria. That is, it's talking about what God is doing, not what David is doing. God is choosing a man according to his criteria. Now that's in contrast to Saul. Saul was chosen according to the people's criteria. They had an idea of what they wanted as a king, and they chose by their criteria. But now God has decided on a man using his own criteria. It doesn't tell us what those criteria are. It only says that God is exercising that choice. In fact, this was terminology that was used for kings 1,000 years before David in Sumerian literature and hundreds of years after David in Babylonian literature. All through this period, the kings in their royal inscriptions would often talk about how the God chose them after their own heart, after the God's own heart, meaning that it was a legitimation. The gods had put this king on the throne. And it's likewise that kind of statement here with David. God has chosen this man to put him on the throne using his own criteria. Now, we get a little hint of what those criteria might be when we get to the story of David and Goliath, because there we find that what quality David has is that he trusts God for the victory. Saul, remember, was chosen so that he could lead out the armies in battle. David's thinking is God's the one who fights the battles. God's the one who's the king. God's the one who's the champion and the hero. I just show up. That's what God wanted to see in a king. David may have had other good qualities. We could enumerate them. David also had his challenges and his struggles and his sins. To identify David as a man after God's own heart means that God has chosen him to be king, the kind of king that he wants for Israel. Saul was the kind of king Israel wanted, and they got what they deserved. God does that sometimes. But now God has chosen.